My name is Dale Pruitt, and I was 36 years old and had been hunting the Ozarks every October since I was old enough to hold a rifle, when I watched something reach up out of the dark and pull my cousin Ray off a tree stand 22 feet in the air. What I saw that night had a reach that cleared the lower branches without effort and hands that closed around the aluminum rail like it was a sapling stem. I have told this account to exactly 2 people in the years since that night in October 2003, and both of them stopped asking me questions before I reached the end. I am speaking now because a man named Dr. Ellis, who said he was affiliated with a folklore documentation project through the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, tracked me down through an online hunting forum where my brother had posted a comment about our trip without my knowledge or consent. My brother meant no harm. He had been in a conversation thread about unusual encounters in the Ozark National Forest and mentioned in passing that his brother had experienced something he would not talk about on that particular ridge in Carroll County, and Dr. Ellis had been following that thread and found my brother and eventually found me. I agreed to sit down with him on 3 conditions. First, that my cousin Ray's full name not be used or published, because Ray has spent considerable time and effort putting this behind him, and whatever happened to him is his to disclose or not disclose as he sees fit. Second, that I not be asked to go back up there, because I will not. Third, that the record of this conversation, whatever use is made of it, reflect that I am not seeking attention or sympathy or belief. I am a licensed commercial electrician. I have been working in that trade for 27 years. I am not given to exaggeration or flights of imagination, and I have been asked directly more than once whether I was under the influence of anything on that night, and the answer is no, categorically and without qualification, and I resent the question every time it comes. What I am going to describe happened on the ridge above Crooked Creek in Carroll County, Arkansas, in the 3rd week of October in 2003. 3 nights and parts of 4 days on ground that Ray and I had hunted together for the better part of a decade. I want to say at the beginning that the place felt familiar to us. We knew that timber. We knew the deer trails and the bedding areas, and the oak flats, and the way the thermals moved on the north-facing slopes in the morning and afternoon. It was not strange ground to us. I want that to be understood before I tell you what happened there, because the strangeness of what happened is not a function of unfamiliarity. It happened on ground we knew, in a season that started like every other season, with 2 men driving up a mountain with their gear and their expectations, and no particular sense that anything was about to change. I should tell you about the strap before I start. I have a length of 2-inch nylon safety harness strap in the glove box of my truck. It has been there since the morning of the 16th of October 2003, when I found it lying in the leaves at the base of my cousin's tree. The aluminum buckle on this strap is bent outward. Not sideways, not folded over, but bent directly outward from the face of the buckle, as if something gripped the strap below the buckle and pulled it straight down with enormous force. I have shown this strap to 3 people over the years: a materials engineer I know professionally, a climbing equipment instructor I met at a trade show, and Dr. Ellis himself in the weeks before this interview. None of them has been able to explain the direction of the bend by any force that would be applied from above, which is the only direction a person falling from a stand would apply force. Every one of them agrees that the deformation is consistent with a very large downward pull applied from below the buckle, from ground level. I keep it in the glove box because it is the only physical object that proves something happened on that ridge beyond what a fall can explain, and because I do not know what else to do with it. There is one other thing I want to say before I begin the account itself. Several weeks after that night, Ray called me and told me that he had started to remember things, not in sequence and not with any clarity, but in the way that certain dreams come back to you during an ordinary afternoon, arriving whole out of nowhere and then dissolving. He told me what he remembered, and I want you to know in advance that I will come back to his account at the end of mine. The detail he gave me about the cold is the one that has never left me. What he told me about the sound is the one that changed how I understand the encounter. And there is a third thing he told me, which I asked him not to repeat, and which I am going to keep back, Not to be dramatic about it, but because it is the one detail that suggests the creature made a deliberate choice about what to do with Ray, and made a different deliberate choice about me, and I am not certain I am ready to have that on a recording. The trip was planned for the 3rd week of October. We drove up from Fayetteville on Thursday afternoon, the 16th, and it was a good drive, 2.5 hours, the kind of fall day where the sky is that particular blue you only get in October, and the leaves on the ridges are rust and yellow, and the air smells of something you cannot name exactly, but which is clearly the smell of the year ending. We talked about ordinary things on the drive. Ray had a bathroom renovation he was finishing before winter set in. I had a commercial job in Rogers that was running behind schedule. We talked about that, about the drive, about the hunting we had done in previous seasons on this same ground, and the deer we had taken, and the ones we had not. We parked at the bottom of the 2-track, at 2 in the afternoon, and packed our gear up the mountain on foot, which takes about 40 minutes with a full pack. The 2-track goes about halfway up, and then you are on foot regardless, through timber that thickens as you climb, white oaks and red oaks giving way to a denser mix of shagbark hickory and shortleaf pine on the upper slopes, and then back to oaks again on the flat bench where we camped, about a 1/4 mile below the ridge crest. The bench was a place we had used for years. A flat shelf in the hillside with a good drainage away from camp, and a limestone outcrop on the uphill side that gave us some shelter from north wind. We had a routine for setting up that we had refined over many years together. Ray handled the tent and the cook kit, while I organized the food storage and the gear bags, and by the time the light was getting low, we had a functional camp and coffee going on the small gas stove, and an hour of daylight left to walk the stands. The stands were hung about a 1/4 mile up the ridge from camp, on the crest overlooking the creek hollow to the west. We had put the mounting hardware in the trees the previous season and left it there through the year, so setting up was a matter of hauling the platforms up and hooking them to the hardware and checking the cables and straps. Ray's stand was hung in a large white oak, about 80 yards south of mine. His tree gave him a view down the west slope into the hollow and along the creek bottom for a considerable distance. My stand was hung in a red oak that stood at the top of a shooting lane through younger timber to the north. Good positions. Positions we had scouted and selected over years of hunting that ground. We had the stand set by 4 in the afternoon and climbed down and went back to camp and ate beans and cornbread that Ray had made ahead of time, and we talked about the season and the weather, and turned in by 8. Thursday night was unremarkable in every respect. I slept well. The temperature dropped to around 28 degrees, and there was frost on the tent fly when my alarm went off at 4:15, and the walk up to the stands in the pre-dawn dark was quiet in the particular way that frost-covered leaves are quiet, compressing underfoot rather than crunching, which is better for deer hunters, and which I noted approvingly in the way you note anything that goes in your favor. We sat until 10 on Friday morning. I saw 2 does at first light moving along a bench below my position, too far and moving away, nothing worth a shot. Ray saw a small buck at the edge of his lane just after sunrise and decided to pass on it. We climbed down at 10 and Ray said he wanted to walk the creek bottom and look for sign, and I said I would walk with him, and we went down the west slope into the hollow and walked along the creek for about half a mile before Ray stopped. He had found the track. It was in the creek mud in a place where the bank had eroded and left a shelf of soft exposed clay, about 6 feet wide and 4 feet deep, the kind of flat mud that holds an impression perfectly. There was one track, just the one, and it was pressed deep into the clay, deeper than my boot sinks in similar mud, which tells you something about the weight behind it. Ray put his boot beside it for scale. His boot is a size 11, which is roughly 12 inches in length. The track was 16 inches long by that comparison. It was barefoot, 5 toes, widely spaced, each one with a defined impression in the clay, and a heel that had sunk perhaps 1.5 inches into the mud, that I would estimate takes at least 300 pounds to achieve. The proportions were wrong for any animal I knew. The arch was shallower than a human arch. The ball of the foot was wider relative to the length than any human foot. The stride from this print to where the disturbance in the clay ended was not visible, because the creature had apparently stepped from the clay back onto gravel or into the creek itself, but the single print was clear and complete. Ray studied it for a while. He turned it over in his mind in the way he did things, looking for the practical explanation. He said it could be a large man walking barefoot in the creek. He said the clay could distort impressions. He took a photograph with his phone, which was the smart thing to do, and then he said we should keep moving, and we did. I did not say what I was thinking, which was that no man that large walks barefoot in a Carroll County creek in mid-October when the water temperature is somewhere in the 40s and the nights go below freezing. I did not say it because Ray had his explanation, and I did not want to be the one who introduced the other kind of explanation out loud. Not yet. Not when it was still daylight, and the track was just a track. We walked back to camp and ate lunch, and went back up to the stands at 3 in the afternoon to sit through the last light. The afternoon was clear and cold, the wind from the northwest at about 8 miles an hour, enough to keep the deer from smelling us if we were careful about it. I settled into the stand at 3:30 and spent the first hour glassing the timber in front of me and watching the feeding areas and thinking about the track. Ray was 80 yards to my south, and I could see his outline when I first got up, but by 4:30 the light was in my eyes from the west, and I could not see him clearly. It was at around 5:15 that I first noticed the birds stop. I had been watching a white-tailed doe moving along the far edge of my shooting lane, too far for a shot but pleasant to watch in the afternoon light, when I realized that I could no longer hear the woodpeckers that had been working the dead snag to my north. This did not register immediately as strange, because birds stop working at dusk, and it was getting toward that time. But then I realized the chickadees had stopped. The chickadees and the titmice work the oaks until it is genuinely dark, long after the bigger birds have quit, and they had stopped all at once. Not tapered off, stopped. The doe I had been watching raised her head and stood motionless for 4 seconds, and then turned and walked quickly into the timber to the east, away from the hollow, and did not look back. I sat very still and listened. The silence was total. This is the word I keep using, and it is not adequate to describe the experience, but it is the most accurate word I have. Total silence in a forest is not the same thing as quiet. Quiet is a diminishment of sound. What settled over that ridge in the space of perhaps 10 seconds was an erasure of sound, as if something with authority over the acoustic environment had simply turned it off. No wind, no leaf movement, no insects. Though at that elevation in October, insects are already scarce, but the ones that remained simply stopped. The creek, which I could hear faintly from the stand on still evenings, was gone. The silence had a physical quality, a pressure, the way a room pressurizes when a door is sealed. I sat in that for 30 seconds, perhaps 40, and then the knock came. It came from below the ridge, from the direction of the creek hollow, from a position I estimated at 400 or 500 yards downslope to the southwest. A single impact, wood on wood, but not a woodpecker impact and not a branch fall. I have heard woodpeckers drum their whole lives, and I have heard branches fall from rotten trees, and I have heard bucks rub their antlers on saplings, and I have heard every sound a forest makes in the ordinary course of its business, and this was none of those sounds. It was too low in frequency for a woodpecker, which produces a sharp, high impact. It was too deliberate and too measured for a branch fall, and it was too loud. The loudness of it was wrong. Whatever struck that tree struck it with enormous force, the kind of force that says something about the mass of what is holding whatever made contact. And then, before I had finished processing the sound through the air, I felt it. The vibration came up through the stand, through the platform, through the mounting cables, through the seat, and into my body through the soles of my boots and through the contact points of my legs and hips and back, with the seat and the safety rail. A low, resonant tremor, not strong enough to shake the stand visibly, but unmistakable as a transmission through solid metal, like putting your hand on the hood of a running engine. Whatever struck that tree, struck it hard enough to send a vibration through the ground, and into the root system of my tree, and up through the bark, and the trunk, and into the steel hardware mounted to that trunk, and into the stand, and into me. I have thought about this for 20 years, and I cannot explain it any other way. The ground transmitted that impact. I did not move. I gripped the safety rail, and I did not move, and I looked in the direction the sound had come from, which was dark timber below the ridge, and I saw nothing. After about 10 minutes, the chickadees came back, hesitantly, a couple at a time, and the ordinary sounds of the forest resumed in stages. Birds first, then the distant sound of the creek, then the wind picking up again. By the time it was properly dark, and I needed to climb down, I had almost persuaded myself that I had imagined the vibration. Almost. I climbed down and walked back to camp, and Ray was already there, and I made a decision not to tell him about the knock, and that decision is one I have turned over many times. My reasoning, such as it was this. Ray was a practical man. If I told him about the knock and he dismissed it, we would go back up the next evening as planned, and he would be on that ridge with a confidence he might not have earned. If I told him, and he took it seriously, we might leave before we had good reason to leave, and I was not yet certain we had good reason to leave. What I know now, that I did not know then, is that the time to leave had already passed, and that my uncertainty was a luxury I was not in a position to afford. That night at the campfire, Ray brought up the track again. He had found a website on his phone before we lost the signal. Something about historical Bigfoot sightings in Carroll County, going back to the 1950s. And he read some of it aloud in a tone of good-natured skepticism, and we both laughed about it and moved on to other things. I went to bed at 8:30 and slept until something woke me before my alarm. I am not certain what woke me. I was lying in my sleeping bag in the dark, and I was awake, fully and suddenly, not the gradual surfacing of ordinary sleep, but the sharp transition that happens when something in the environment has changed. I lay still and listened. The tent was dark. I could hear the creek. I could hear the wind in the trees above camp. And then I heard something else, or I believed I did, from the uphill side of the tent, from somewhere in the timber above camp on the slope toward the ridge. A sound that was rhythmic and slow and measured, the way something breathes when it is at rest, not fast, not labored, slow and deep and completely still in the spaces between, the way something breathes when it is simply standing somewhere in the dark and has nowhere in particular it needs to be. I lay motionless in the bag and listened to that sound for what I estimate was 30 seconds, and then it stopped, and I lay there until my alarm went off at 4:15, not sleeping again. When I came out of the tent in the dark with my headlamp, I checked the camp perimeter. I did it without consciously deciding to do it, which tells me some part of me already knew something was wrong. I went around the camp in a wide arc with the light at the ground, and I found 3 things that morning that I have not discussed with anyone until this conversation. The first was the camp chairs. We had 2 folding camp chairs, the kind with the cup holders in the arms, and we had left them facing the fire ring, the way you leave chairs when you are done sitting in them. They had been turned during the night, both of them, facing now into the timber on the uphill side of camp, toward the slope above the limestone outcrop. Not knocked over, not displaced, turned, deliberately, as if something had sat in each one in sequence and arranged itself to look up the hill, and then risen and left them facing that way. The second thing was a print in the mud beside the water jug we kept near the tent fly. The ground there was soft from where we had been walking in and out of the tent and spilling water when we filled the cooking pot, and in the soft earth beside the base of the jug there was an impression. Not a full track, but enough of one to see the spread of the forefoot and the beginning of a toe impression, and it was large, and it was shaped like nothing I can attribute to any animal I know that walks through Carroll County. The impression was fresh. The edges were clean and had not dried or crumbled. Whatever made it had been there in the hours since we had last been near the jug. The third thing was the jug itself. We had capped it before we went to sleep. I am certain of it, because Ray had done it after his last cup of water, and I had watched him do it. The cap was off. It was sitting beside the jug, right side up, placed, not rolled away, not lying sideways. Placed beside the jug as if someone had removed it, done something with the jug, and put the cap down deliberately. I put the cap back on the jug. I turned the camp chairs back toward the fire ring. I did not tell Ray any of it. I have asked myself many times why I said nothing. Part of it was the explanation I gave myself, which was that I did not want to alarm him without being certain of what I had found. Part of it, the part I am less comfortable with, was that telling Ray would have made the situation real in a way that I was not yet ready to accept. There is a period of time in any encounter with something that should not exist in which you can maintain a version of reality where the ordinary explanations are still possible, and I was clinging to that period. What I should have done was simple: tell Ray, pack the truck, drive home. What I did instead was nothing, twice, and then a third time. Saturday morning we went up and sat and saw nothing. A pair of turkeys at 7, working their way along the creek bottom below Ray's position, not interesting to either of us in deer season. A coyote at 9, moving fast along the bench below the ridge, looking back over its shoulder as it went. I noted the coyote looking back, and I noted what it was looking back toward, which was the creek hollow below Ray's stand, and I said nothing about it to Ray. We came down at 10:30 and walked the 2-track back toward camp, and that is when we met the man. He was coming up the 2-track on foot, which was unusual because the track was rough enough that most people drove it in a truck if they were coming to hunt. He was in his mid-60s, I would estimate, wearing brown canvas coveralls that were faded and worn in the way that things get worn from actual use rather than from being washed too many times. And he was carrying a rifle that I identified as an older Marlin lever action, a 45-70 by the look of it, the kind of rifle that men in that country had been carrying for 100 years. He had a face that had spent considerable time outdoors, and he stopped when he saw us coming down, and he looked at us for a moment before he spoke. Ray said good morning and asked if he was going up. The man said he had hunted that ridge for the better part of 20 years and had stopped coming about 4 years back. Ray asked him why, and the man looked at Ray and then at me and then back at Ray with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite warning, but somewhere between the two. He said that some places are older than the people who use them, and that the things living in those places have their own understanding of what belongs there and what does not. Ray asked him what specifically had made him stop coming, because Ray was a direct man who did not do well with vague answers. The old man was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I had a dog run up that hollow and not come back. Good dog. Had him 7 years. I went up to look for him and found his collar at the base of a tree. Just the collar. No blood, no fur, no nothing else. Just the collar, hanging from a branch, at a height no dog reaches, and no dog puts itself." He looked at Ray again, and then said, "There are some places where you are the visitor, and that is the whole of it." Then he turned around and walked back down the 2-track to his truck and drove away. Ray watched him go and said, "That was not helpful." I said nothing. We went back to camp. We had a long conversation that afternoon about whether to stay for the 3rd night. It was the conversation we should have had after the camp chairs and the water jug, but we were having it now, and I want to be accurate about how it went. Ray was inclined to stay. He had driven 3 hours and had 2 days of sitting to show for it, and he had seen no deer worth shooting, and he was not willing to go home empty-handed on the basis of a peculiar old man and a muddy footprint. I said I was inclined to leave, which was the first honest thing I had said on that trip about how I was feeling. Ray asked me why. I told him about the knock, finally, on Friday evening, and I told him about the vibration in the stand. I did not tell him about the camp chairs or the water jug, because I still had not fully made up my mind to accept what those things meant. Ray listened to the knock and the vibration, and was quiet for a while, and then said that a falling tree could transmit through the ground, and that sounds traveled strangely in mountain terrain, and that neither of those things constituted a reason to leave. I said I knew that. He said, "Then let's stay one more night and be in the stands before dark, and have a proper look around while there's still light." And I said yes, because I did not have an argument that did not require me to say out loud the thing I had been refusing to say. We ate an early dinner, and went up to the stands at 4:30, which gave us a half-hour of good light to settle in and scan the timber before the dark came. I climbed my tree and hooked into the safety harness, and sat down and checked the cables and the hardware the way you do at the start of every sit. Everything was solid. The stand was level, and the mounting was tight, and the cables were good. I glassed the timber below me and saw nothing out of the ordinary. I could see Ray's outline against the sky when I first got up, his shape against the lighter western horizon, and I watched him settle into his stand and get his rifle across his lap the way he always did. I want to describe the light as it went that evening, because the quality of the light was part of what made that night what it became. The cloud cover that had moved in during the afternoon thickened as the sun went down, so that instead of the gradual bronze-to-gray transition of a clear October sunset, the light simply drained away, evenly and quickly, as if someone were slowly closing a shade. By 5:40, the timber below me was already dark. By 6, I could not see Ray's outline at all, only a vague absence in the sky where his tree was. The creek hollow below and to the west was a well of pure darkness by the time the last light left the ridge crest, and the darkness had a depth to it, a weight, that I found myself reluctant to look at directly. The temperature was falling fast. The 40s of the afternoon were already gone, and the air had the clarity that comes with the hard cold, the kind that makes distant sounds carry, and close sounds seem closer than they are. I settled into the stand and pulled the fleece collar of my jacket up and sat still and watched the dark and listened. For 30 minutes, nothing happened. The first half hour was ordinary in every sense. I heard a squirrel moving through the leaves somewhere below me to the east. I heard what I thought was a great horned owl call once, from the direction of the creek, though it was only the one call and not repeated. I heard Ray shift in his stand, the small metallic click of weight redistributing, 80 yards to my south. I heard the wind in the upper canopy, a soft white noise that is one of the most comfortable sounds I know, and which, for some reason, began to feel less comfortable as the first hour wore on. At approximately 6:40, the wind stopped, not diminished, stopped. The canopy above me fell silent in a single moment, and then the rest of the sounds went with it, and I was sitting in that silence again, the total silence, the one with the physical quality, the one that had a weight behind it like a hand pressing on the chest. I knew it this time. I recognized it. My body had the response before my mind caught up, a spike of adrenaline so sharp and immediate that my hands went cold, and my vision narrowed, and my heart rate doubled in the span of a breath. My body had decided what this silence was, even if my mind was still trying to negotiate. The knock came 14 seconds later. I know because I was watching my watch, which I had started doing without consciously deciding to, counting the seconds of the silence in the way you count seconds between lightning and thunder. 14 seconds after the silence, the knock came from the creek hollow below and to the southwest of Ray's stand. But closer than Friday, much closer, perhaps 150 yards rather than 400 or 500, and the vibration in the stand was immediate this time, no delay, no half-second lag. The ground transmitted the impact before the sound even cleared the timber. The platform I was sitting on buzzed against my legs like a struck tuning fork. I put my hand on the mounting cable that runs from the stand hardware to the lag bolt in the tree. The cable was vibrating. Faintly, but it was vibrating, and the vibration had a frequency that I had not put into it by sitting down or by adjusting my weight. Something had sent that frequency up through the root system of this tree and into the steel. The knock did not repeat. What followed it was not the gradual return of ordinary sound that I had experienced on Friday. The silence held. It held for a long time, perhaps 10 or 12 minutes, and during those minutes I heard something moving in the timber below. Moving on 2 legs. I need to be precise about this, because it matters. I have spent 20 years trying to find an alternative explanation for the sound of what was moving below me that night, and I have not found one. Deer are 4-legged and move with a particular shuffle and pause rhythm that any hunter knows. Bears are 4-legged and make a heavy dragging sound when they walk, the rear feet sweeping forward behind the front. turkeys walk, but they are small, and their footfall on leaves is inconsequential. What I heard below me was bipedal. The footfalls came in pairs, left and right, with the regularity and the spacing of a tall walking human, but with a weight behind each step that no human produces on dry leaves. When a person walks through frozen October leaves, at a normal pace, the sound is a sustained crunch, crunch, crunch. What I was hearing was a flat compression, left foot, then right foot, then left, each impact driving the leaves flat rather than scattering them, each impact with the weight behind it of something that made the ground work harder than any man makes it work, and the stride length. Even from my stand, I could estimate the stride length by timing the interval between footfalls at what sounded like an unhurried pace. The interval was long, very long. At a stride length of 3 feet and a moderate walking pace, the footfall interval is about 1.5 seconds. What I was hearing had an interval of nearly 3 seconds between steps at what sounded like a completely unhurried walk. A 3-second interval at a walking pace implies a stride of roughly 5 to 6 feet. It was moving upslope, toward the ridge, toward raised tree. I had my rifle across my lap. I had not raised it. I want to be honest about this. The rifle was across my lap, and the safety was on, and I did not raise it. And the reason I did not raise it was not a tactical calculation. The reason was that I was incapable of it, or very nearly. What I felt in those minutes was a fear so fundamental and so physical that it operated below volition, below decision, at the level of reflex and instinct, the level where your body makes choices without consulting you. My body had decided that absolute stillness was the correct response, and it was enforcing that decision without my permission. I sat in that stand, and I did not move, and I watched the direction the sound was coming from, and I waited. The moon had been behind clouds all evening, but around 7 o'clock there was a break in the cover, a thin clearing that let through just enough light to create a difference between the sky at the horizon and the timber below it. It was against this lighter band of sky that I saw the eyes. They were amber, a clear, slightly orange amber, not the red of a deer's eye shine in a flashlight, and not the green of a coyote. Amber, and lit from within in the way that eye shine is lit, reflecting available light rather than generating it. But the ambient light that night was so low that the amount of reflective surface necessary to produce what I was seeing had to be considerable. The eyes were separated by a distance I estimated at the time as 6 to 8 inches, which is not a distance that belongs to any animal I have ever seen in the field. A bear's eyes in eyeshine are separated by perhaps 3 or 4 inches. A deer is less than that. What I was seeing had eyes separated by something approaching twice the width of a bear. And they were high. They were at a height that initially confused me because my brain was trying to assign them to an elevated position, a ridge above the hollow or a ledge above the creek bank, because the height required to put eyes at that elevation above the creek hollow floor placed them at somewhere between 9 and 10 feet above the ground. I processed this for several seconds before my brain accepted what I was actually seeing, which was that these eyes were at 9 or 10 feet above the ground because whatever held them was standing on the ground and was 9 or 10 feet tall. They were stationary for perhaps 30 seconds. Then they moved. They moved upslope, toward the ridge, toward raised tree, and they moved with the footfalls I had been hearing, left and right, slow and flat and heavy. And as they moved upslope, they rose slightly, because the ground rose in that direction, and I could track them against the gray line of sky, even when the moon went back behind cloud. I watched them move through the timber below me, through the dark between the trees, and they did not deviate and they did not stop, and their pace was unhurried in a way that was more frightening than speed would have been. Whatever was moving toward raised tree had nowhere else to be, and nothing else to do, and no concern about being heard or seen or opposed. The eyes stopped at the base of raised tree. I did not call out. I want to explain this, and I want to be honest about the explanation. The honest explanation is that I was incapable of producing sound in those seconds. The adrenaline had narrowed my focus to the point where I was not processing my own situation, only the situation in front of me. And the situation in front of me was that something was standing at the base of my cousin's tree, and I had no idea what would happen next, and I had no coherent thought about what my options were. I sat with the rifle across my lap, and I watched the amber eyes at the base of the tree. Then Ray's stand moved. The sound it made was structural, metallic. The sound of significant force being applied to a rigid frame. Not a rattle, not a swing, a flex. The cables went tight. I could hear the tension in them from 80 yards, the low hum of steel cable under sudden load, and the platform itself made a sound like the hull of a small boat hit by a wave. I have sat in tree stands for 25 years, and I have never heard a stand make that sound under a person's weight. Whatever was pressing against the base of that tree was pressing with a force that traveled up the trunk and into the stand hardware and flexed the platform 22 feet above. Ray made a sound, not words. An involuntary sound, the kind a person makes when the floor drops away without warning, a compressed vocalization from the diaphragm, pure surprise and pure physical response. And then I heard the harness strap. The harness strap on a quality tree stand is a 2-inch nylon webbing with an aluminum alloy buckle rated to a working load of over 2,000 pounds. The strap is designed to hold a person to the tree in the event of a fall, to catch and arrest the fall rather than prevent it, and a fall from a tree stand exerts several times a person's body weight on the strap through the dynamics of the arrest. The working load rating accounts for this. The strap is not designed to fail under any force a falling person generates. I heard the strap under load. The sound of nylon webbing under tension is a specific sound, a kind of tight, high-frequency hum, not loud but distinct, the sound of material being asked to do the job it was made for. I heard that hum come up from the direction of Ray's stand, climbing in pitch as the load increased, and I heard the buckle clicking, the pole and the housing working against each other under a force that was pulling them in the direction of the open, the direction of release. And then I heard the strap give. It did not snap clean. If it had snapped clean, I think the sound would have been less terrible. The strap tore. It went slowly at first and then all at once, the way ice goes across a pond, a creeping progression of failure that accelerates to a point and then releases everything at once. And the sound of it releasing was somewhere between a rifle shot and a length of canvas tearing, and from the darkness above me, from the stand 80 yards to the south, I heard my cousin's voice say my name. One syllable, just my name, and then he was gone from the stand. I heard him hit the lower branches on the way down, 2 impacts in quick succession, and then I heard the sound of a person landing on frozen ground from a considerable height, which is a sound that I will not describe further, and then I heard nothing from Ray at all. What I heard after Ray hit the ground was the footfalls resuming, moving downslope, moving away from the ridge, back toward the creek hollow, back the way they had come, but slower now, and with a different rhythm, an altered rhythm, the rhythm of something carrying a load on one side. Left foot, heavier, right foot, lighter, left foot, heavier, the rhythm of something walking with a considerable weight under one arm. I did not move. I want to account for myself accurately on this point. I stayed in that stand. For 4 hours I stayed in that stand above the place where my cousin had been on the ground, and I need you to know the texture of those 4 hours, not as a defense of myself, because I am not interested in defending myself, but because I think the texture of it is part of what I experienced that night, part of what I know about what was on that ridge. In the first minutes after the footfalls moved away downslope, I was operating almost entirely below conscious thought. The adrenaline had reduced my functioning to something close to basic. I was aware of the stand. I was aware of my hands on the safety rail. I was aware of my heartbeat, which was very fast and very loud in my ears, and I was aware of the dark below me where the sound had been. For the first 30 minutes, I do not think I had a coherent thought in the conventional sense. I was simply present and still and listening, and that was the totality of my existence. After 30 minutes, something like thought returned. And what I thought, what I held in my mind as clearly as I have ever held anything, was that the thing that had taken Ray was still in the timber below the ridge. I could not hear it, but the silence had not broken. The birds had not returned. The creek was still absent. The same silence that had preceded the knock and the footfalls and the attack on Ray's stand was still in place around me, and its continued presence told me that whatever had imposed it was still there. This was not logic or analysis. It was understanding of the most direct and animal kind. My body knew it. I watched my watch in the glow of the screen, counting the minutes. At 9 o'clock I heard a single sound from the direction of the creek hollow, far below and to the southwest, a sound that was not a wood knock and not a footfall but something else, lower and more complex, something that I can only describe as vaguely vocal in the way that a vibrating instrument string is vaguely vocal, a sustained low tone that did not repeat. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds and then stopped. I have no explanation for this sound. I have never heard anything like it before or since. At 10 o'clock I heard the first chickadee. It called once, from the direction of the limestone outcrop above the camp bench, and then went quiet, and then called again, and then a second chickadee answered it from somewhere to the east, and within 10 minutes the night birds had resumed, and the creek sound had returned, and the wind was back in the upper canopy, and the silence, the particular structured silence that I had come to associate with that presence, was over. I sat until 2:40 in the morning. I know this because I watched every minute of it go by on my watch screen. I sat until I had 30 solid minutes of ordinary forest sound, continuous and uninterrupted, and then I turned on my headlamp and climbed down. I came down slowly, checking each step, because my legs were not entirely reliable after 4 hours of motionlessness in the cold. When I reached the ground, I stood for a moment and then walked toward Ray's tree with the light at the ground. The beam found the strap before I reached the base of the tree. It was lying in the leaves about 6 feet from the trunk, bent at an angle where it had been pulled clear of the stand hardware. I picked it up and looked at the buckle. The buckle was bent outward from the face. Not to the side, not back along the length of the strap, but outward, directly outward from the face of the housing, as if something below the buckle had gripped the strap and pulled it straight down with a force that the buckle was not designed to resist in that direction, because a buckle is designed to resist pull along its length, not pull perpendicular to its face. A falling person pulls along the length of the strap. What bent that buckle pulled perpendicular to its face. From below, I folded the strap and put it in my jacket pocket and looked at the ground around the base of the tree. The leaves had been disturbed in a wide area, scuffed and pressed in ways that a falling person alone could not account for. The disturbance extended south of the tree in a path going downslope, displaced leaves and bent brush, a trail of physical disturbance heading toward the creek hollow. I followed this trail with the headlamp as far as the creek crossing, perhaps 150 yards from the tree. At the creek bank I stopped. The crossing was a flat shelf of creek stone, and in the silt that had collected between the stones there were impressions that I could see clearly in the headlamp. One set of large bipedal prints, going south, crossing into the dark timber on the far side of the creek. I stood at the bank and shone the light across, and saw the dark timber, and heard the creek running over the stone, and I did not cross. I turned around and walked back to camp, and got in my truck and locked the doors and started the engine, and turned the heater on, and sat there in the dark until 4:30 in the morning. Then I drove down the mountain to where I had a phone signal and called 911. The Carroll County Sheriff's Department sent 2 deputies before 7 in the morning, and we went up the ridge together at first light. I showed them Ray's tree, and the disturbed leaves and the path going toward the creek, and the track in the creek mud, which was still partially intact. The deputies were professional and thorough in the way that rural law enforcement is thorough when it needs to be, and they walked the path of disturbance as far as the creek and radioed for more units, and an organized search began by 8 o'clock with 4 officers and 2 dogs. They found Ray at 9:15. He was 2¼ miles from the base of his tree, on the far side of the creek, in a dry cedar hollow on the south-facing slope of a ridge I had never hunted and had not been on before. He was sitting with his back against a large cedar tree, leaning against it, not lying down, not collapsed, sitting upright with his hands in his lap and his eyes open. He was conscious and responsive to the deputies who reached him first. He told them he did not know where he was. He told them he did not know how he had gotten there. When they asked him what had happened, he said he remembered being in his stand, and then he remembered being against the cedar tree, and there was nothing between those two memories. Not confusion, not darkness, not a sense of time passing, simply a gap, a section of experience with nothing in it. He was transported to the hospital in Eureka Springs and admitted for observation. He had no broken bones, no lacerations, no signs of a fall impact on his hands or face or head. His jacket was intact, and his boots were on his feet, and his coat was buttoned against the cold. The only physical finding that the medical report documented was bruising on his left shoulder, specifically on the superior aspect of the shoulder near the acromioclavicular joint, which is the top of the shoulder. The bruising was described in the report as consistent with a significant compressive force applied from above. The pattern of the bruising, as the examining physician described it to me, and as it appears in the report, was consistent with a gripping force, 4 points of pressure arranged like the fingers of a large hand, and a 5th point of pressure below corresponding to a thumb, but scaled considerably larger than any human hand. The span of the grip implied by the bruise pattern was, by the physician's estimate, 11 to 13 inches from the outermost finger contact to the thumb contact. Ray's rifle was on the stand when he sat down in it that evening. It was gone when the deputies found him in the cedar hollow. His day pack was gone. Neither item was ever found. The deputies searched the area around the cedar hollow and the route between the ridge and the hollow, and found nothing. The incident report filed by the Carroll County Sheriff's Department characterized the event as a probable fall from a tree stand, resulting in temporary disorientation and displacement. I have read this report many times. It does not account for the 2¼ miles between where Ray fell and where he was found, over terrain that includes a creek crossing and 2 ridge faces, and dense cedar brush that would be impossible to navigate in darkness in a disoriented state, particularly with the bruising on the shoulder that would have made any effort with that arm extremely painful. It does not account for the fact that Ray had no mud on his boots or his clothing consistent with walking that distance across the creek and through the cedar brush. It does not account for the buckle on the harness strap, which the deputies looked at and did not take into evidence, and which I still have. I went back to the ridge 3 weeks later. I went in the middle of a clear, dry day in November, by myself, and I did not bring a rifle, and I want to be clear about why I went. I went because I needed to look at the tree in daylight and understand what had happened there with my own eyes, in my own time, and I needed to do it once, so that I could stop needing to do it. I parked at the bottom of the 2-track and walked up, and found Ray's tree and examined the base of it carefully. 3 things were at the base of that tree that had not been there on the morning I had last examined it. The first was a circle of river stones. There were 17 of them, smooth oval creek stones of the kind that come from the gravel bar at the bottom of the hollow, each one roughly the size of a man's fist, arranged in a circle approximately 24 inches in diameter at the base of the tree. The stones were not native to the hillside. The nearest place to collect creek stones of that kind was the creek bed 150 yards downslope. Someone or something had made 17 trips to the creek and back, or had carried them all in one trip to place them at the base of this specific tree in a circle of this specific size. They were not haphazardly arranged. They were evenly spaced, and the circle was nearly geometrically precise. The second thing was a handprint on the bark of the tree. It was on the east side of the trunk, at a height of approximately 9 feet, pressed into the outer bark layers with enough force to leave a clear and lasting impression. I measured the width of this impression with a length of paracord I had in my pocket, and with my boot length as a reference. The impression was approximately 14 inches wide at the widest point, measured across the palm. My hand is approximately 4 inches wide across the palm. Inside the impression, my hand fit with 6 or 7 inches of space remaining on either side. The third thing I found at the base of that tree, I am not going to describe in complete detail. It was biological in nature. It was placed within the stone circle, not dropped or scattered there by any natural process, but placed, arranged within the circle, in a way that indicates understanding of the circle as a defined space and intention with respect to what was put inside it. I photographed it. I described the photograph to Ray when I saw him the following month, and that was one of 2 things I told him about the return visit that I regret telling him. I will only say that whatever left it at the base of that tree was marking something. Not territory in the way that animals mark territory with scent, marking in the way that something marks an account that is settled. Ray called me in late November to say that he had started to remember things from the night. He was apologetic about it, as if the memories were an inconvenience he had not asked for and did not want to impose on me with. He said they came back in pieces, out of sequence, the way certain dreams return during an ordinary day, whole and sudden, and then gone again. He told me 4 things. The first was the cold. He said the first thing he could remember after the stand was cold, not the ambient cold of an October night in the Ozarks, which he knew, but a different cold, the cold of something in contact with him that was itself cold, in a way that living things are not cold, a deep, structural cold, as if whatever held him had been in the creek water for a long time, or had a temperature that was not produced by any metabolic process he could connect to any animal he had ever handled or skinned. He said it was the most specific and the most persistent of the memories. He told me the second thing, which was the sound. He said he remembered a sound, low and sustained, not like a voice but like a note, held very long on a large instrument, a resonance rather than a vocalization, and he said it did not feel as if it was directed at him, but as if it was simply present, the way weather is present, all around, and not addressed to anyone. He said it happened once, and then he was against the cedar tree, and it was quiet, and the deputies were calling his name across the hillside. He told me the third thing, and I asked him not to repeat it, and he agreed, and I am keeping that agreement. What I can say is that the third thing tells me that whatever carried Ray 2¼ miles through the dark and set him against that cedar tree did not do so at random or incidentally. It placed him there with a specific intention about the position and the location, and the third thing Ray described is consistent with that placement being a response to something, a kind of deliberate communication, addressed to him or to me, or to whoever would eventually find him. Something about the encounter was purposeful, at a level I am not equipped to fully analyze. Something about it was deliberate and specific, and not the behavior of a thing operating on pure instinct. The fourth thing he told me was simply this, that he had not felt afraid. And that is the thing I have turned over most often in the 20 years since, because I was afraid from the moment the silence fell, and I am afraid now in ways that have not diminished. And Ray, who was pulled off a tree stand in the dark and carried 2 miles through the Ozark wilderness by something that left a handprint 9 feet up a white oak, was not afraid. And I do not know what to do with that. I am speaking to you in the spring of 20 years after that October. I have not hunted since that season. I have not been back to Carroll County in any capacity related to those hills. Ray lives in Springdale now and works construction, and has moved through his life the way a practical man moves through things, by accepting what cannot be changed and putting his energy into what can be managed. He does not discuss the incident, and I respect that. He recovered from it in the functional sense considerably faster than I did, and as I said earlier, I attribute this to the absence of memory, which is a mercy he was given that I was not. My experience of silence has not been the same since that fall. I have learned, over 20 years, that my nervous system does not distinguish reliably between remembered silence and actual silence, which has made ordinary quiet something that requires management rather than rest. I keep a radio running when I sleep. I keep the television on when I am home alone in the evenings. I have driven in a truck with the radio on at every volume setting except 0 for 20 years, and I do not expect that to change. I still have the strap. It is in my glove box. I have taken it out perhaps 100 times over the years and looked at it under different kinds of light, because the direction of the buckle deformation is something I find myself needing to reconfirm periodically, as if I might have misremembered it, as if in one of those 100 examinations I might find that the buckle bends the other way now and everything can be attributed to a fall. It bends the same way every time, outward from the face, in the direction that only makes sense if something below the buckle, below the tree stand, below the place where a falling person would generate any force at all, reached up and pulled down. I have no conclusion to offer you. I have the strap and I have the bruise measurements from a medical report that is a matter of record and can be verified. And I have 20 years of memory that has not softened in the way that memories typically soften. If anything, certain parts of it have become more precise with time, not less, the way certain photographs develop more detail as the exposure continues. The sound of the footfalls, the height of the eye shine, the pitch of the harness strap under load before it went. I am not going to tell you what it was. That is not what I am here to tell you. What I can tell you is that something is on that ridge above Crooked Creek in Carroll County, Arkansas, and it has been there longer than any of us have been in those hills, and it makes its own accounting of what belongs up there and what does not, and the accounting it made of us in October of 2003 cost my cousin his rifle and his memory, and cost me something that I have not been able to name precisely in 20 years of trying. I carry the bent buckle in my glove box because I do not know where else to put it, and because some mornings when I get in the truck and open the glove box to find my registration or my insurance card, I see it folded there, and I remember that the night was real, and the ridge was real, and whatever moved through that dark was real, and I would rather carry the proof of a thing I cannot explain than pretend the thing did not happen, which is the other choice, and which I have never been able to manage for more than about 10 minutes at a time. That is everything I have to tell you. I appreciate your patience with the way this account comes out of me, which is not in order, and which circles back to certain details more than once. I told you at the start I was not a storyteller. I am a man who had an experience that 20 years has not explained, and I have given you the account as accurately as I am able. Whatever use you make of it is your business. I only ask that you remember that my cousin's name stays out of whatever is published, and that if you do go up to Carroll County for your research, you do not go up to that ridge above Crooked Creek after dark. That is all I have to say on the matter.